Okay, so I've just been handing you rates to use all along here, but in the real world, do you think the gods of finance just hand us down a required rate of return? No, and so we're going to have to figure out that for ourselves. So that's what Chapter 12 is all about. And we know that two things have to go together: risk and, reward or return. And so basically this required rate of return is going to be based on the riskiness of the cash flows of whatever it is that we're looking at. It could be a financial investment. It could be an industrial investment like a factory or a machine. So how are we going to determine this rate? Well, it turns out that we have these amazing laboratories called the financial markets. And the financial markets are really good at looking at cash flows, expected future cash flows, and pricing the risk accordingly. So in an ideal world, what we would do is find a set of cash flows from a financial instrument that is precisely as risky as a set of cash flows from our project or our investment, and we would use that rate. Do you think it's really that simple in reality? No. And so what we end up having to do is kind of look at these markets, and also we can actually figure out what is the cost of the capital for the firm as it is today. So the riskiness of the firm as it is today, we can actually price that out. And it could be that the firm is funded with both equity and debt. It's really easy if it's only equity, because then we only have to find out the required return on the equity. But if there's also debt involved, we're going to need to find out that required return on the debt, and then we're going to have to take the capital structure of the firm into account and use those rates of return that we found in the market to come up with what is called the firm's cost of capital. And then we'll show how that gets related or put onto these projects. So the first question we need to ask is, what is the cost of equity capital? Equity capital would be just you're issuing a common stock. And keep in mind that even though firms are not required to pay dividends, there is still a required return on the stock. Let me give you an example here. I don't think Tesla pays any dividends, yet are people willing to buy its stock? Yeah, what are they expecting? Are they expecting for Elon to suddenly start paying dividends? No, what are they expecting to happen to the stock price? Yeah, that growth, and that growth in the stock price is that expected return. That's what we're expecting the stock price to go up. And so that equity that we had to sell at basically a discounted rate tells us that equity has a cost even when we don't pay dividends. Okay, so we've got two ways to determine equity cost. In Chapter 11, we talked about the capital asset pricing model and the security market line. So that was one way. And then we also, in Chapter 6, talked about the dividend discount model. And we're going to see that CAPM or security market line will work for any firm, but that second one only works for a select group of firms. Are there any questions so far? Okay. Here's our security market line, just in case you've forgotten it. The expected return on the stock is equal to the risk-free rate plus the beta on the same stock. By the way, what's beta a measure of? Systematic risk. Another name for that's market risk or undiversifiable risk. And we had a lot of folks on the exam just didn't get that. Right? So it's where, we've already talked about all that. Let's see. Oh, we have another name for this, expected return minus risk-free rate. What's the name of that thing? And the market risk premium. And be careful when you're reading a problem. If I give you the market risk premium, do you need to go ahead and subtract the risk-free rate from that? No. No, because it's already subtracted out. It's like buying boneless chicken. You don't have to take the bones out of it, right? By the way, go ahead and buy the bones. Spend the extra money. You could really injure yourself or get sick trying to bone a chicken, so don't do that. Yeah, I didn't even mean for that to be funny, right? There we go. Back to the story. Okay, so that's the market risk premium. But if I give you the expected return on the market, you need to subtract the risk-free rate before you multiply by beta. Any questions about security market line? This should be totally review. Okay, so let's talk about what do we need to make this security market line work. We need an estimate of the risk-free rate. We need an estimate of that market risk premium, and we also need an estimate of this beta for the firm. And so I'm going to talk about each one of these in turn. Where do we get our risk-free rate? Does anyone remember what we say is a good stand-in for the risk-free asset? Yeah, 3-month U.S. Treasury bill. So all I've got to do to get my stand-in for the risk-free rate is figure out what is the yield on the 3-month T-bill. Now, some people say, well, hey, wait a minute, there's a 1-month T-bill which has even less interest rate risk or price risk than the 3-month T-bill. And, scientifically that makes good sense. There's only one problem. The 1-month T-bill is relatively rare. It's relatively thinly traded. And so we don't have a lot of good, fresh data for that. So that's why we use the 3-month instead. I have never seen an academic finance study that used a 1-month T-bill as a stand-in for the risk-free rate. So for the purposes of solving our problems, however, you always just want to use whatever Treasury bill yield you're given. And it's so sad because I have people come to my office and they're like, well, I know how to do this problem, but it's missing the risk-free rate. And I say, read the problem back to me. And then they get to the part about the Treasury bill and they're like, I don't get it. Where's the risk-free rate? If you had listened when we talked in class, you would know. It's the 3-month U.S. Treasury bill. Okay, questions? So what about the market risk premium? Typically, as Americans, we use the S&P 500 as our proxy for the market portfolio. One time I was writing an article on the Chinese market. Do you think it was good to use the S&P 500 as my stand-in for the market, for that market? No. And also, then I stupidly used the U.S. 3-month Treasury bill as my stand-in for the risk-free rate. And of course, the reviewer, who was probably Chinese, said, no, don't use that, and he told me what to use, right? And so it just really depends on basically your perspective, even though in theory it should not, right? Because this market portfolio is supposed to be representative of every risky asset known to man, Chinese or American. Does that make sense? But it's the trick of knowing your audience. If you're writing for an American audience, use S&P 500. Okay, so we can determine the return on S&P 500 through historical data. Remember what we did with that linear regression thing? But the question is, how long do I go back? How long do I go back? So I'm going to ask some people who've probably been trained in statistics. Let's see, Ms. Volkova's not here. Anybody else here have had your statistics class, QBA? You were the only one that said yes. You did too? She talks a lot. Let's go with you. Okay, so as a statistician, since you are obviously the only one here qualified to speak, would you prefer a small sample size or a large sample size?
Large.
Yeah, large. And so if we get in statisticians, and don't get me wrong, they're lovely people, but they don't know what's going on with our game here. A statistician will tell you, hey, you people have returns all the way back to 1926. Why don't you just take it all the way back and get the biggest sample possible? And here's the answer why we don't. Do you think the United States economy is the same as it was in 1926? No, in 1926 we're still largely agricultural. Then World War II comes around and we switch from being agricultural to being what? Industrial. And then time goes by, the rest of the world rebuilds from the war, and then we end up in something called the service economy, which is where we were all going to make money by going around clowning and shining each other's shoes, which, by the way, that doesn't last, right? And so then now we're in what they're calling an information economy. So do you think the required return on the market portfolio for each one of those would be exactly the same? No. And so it doesn't make sense to go back further and further in time because your estimate gets stale. Your estimate gets stale. And so you've got this trade-off. You can either have a short, fresh estimate, or you can have but it's got a small sample size. Or you can have a huge sample size, but you can have a stale estimate. And so we're going to have to make a judgment call there. Now, how do we get the market risk premium? All we've got to do is take that expected return for the S&P 500 and subtract out the risk-free rate. Any questions? Okay. So how do we estimate beta? Remember, we use the linear regression. We can use historical data, but betas tend to vary over time. So we've got the same problem here with betas. Now let's talk about companies. Why do you think a company's beta might change over time?
Is it just new opportunity?
Okay, so let's talk about the idea of new. When a company first gets started, let's roll back to 2005 and Google comes out. What do you think, was Google a safe, like, cash generating machine at that point? No. And there was a lot of risk. We didn't know what all was going to go on with Google. And so, of course, their beta was higher in the beginning. If you looked at beta of Google today, I'll bet it would be closer to 1, maybe a little higher than 1, but I'll bet it would be closer. And so we get into the same argument that we did earlier. Look, we could have a more statistically happy estimate of beta, but we'd have to go further and further back in time to get it, and that makes it stale. So once again, we're having to do this trade-off. Questions? By the way, if I'm using a 1-year beta, what do you think I should be doing with my S&P 500? Yeah, so match your time frames. Does that make sense? Match your time frames. By the way, there's more going on here than just changes in the economy overall or changes in the company overall. We have things like, and I'll go back during my own lifetime, we had the 1987 problem in the stock market where everything just really took a dive. We have the dot-com bust. We have September 11th. We have the financial crisis. We have COVID. Now we've got this war going on. I mean, there are weird things going on all the time. Do you think you should go through and try to eliminate the weird things when you're doing your estimate? Ms. Avila says no. Why?
I mean, they're unexpected.
Okay.
And unexpected news is what drives the market.
Okay,
so
very
you
good.
can't really time out unexpected.
Yeah. And the other thing is this. Do you think that weird shit is going to stop happening? No, right? It's just going to keep happening. And so, as an engineer, you want to try to clean things up. No, life is messy. We've got to leave that stuff in there. And so let's go ahead and leave that stuff in there. You do have to be careful picking your time frame. If I just looked only at the pandemic, my estimates might be really squirrely. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, here is Microsoft's time-varying beta. Microsoft, if you go back to 1993, Microsoft had just put out Windows 3.0 or 3.1. I forget, but it was the first widespread Windows. Do you think that was a new and weird idea at the time? Yeah. Until then, we've been using something called DOS, and as an engineering student, I had learned all the DOS commands, and I was a DOS master. And they come up with Windows, and I'm like, clicking on pictures, that's stupid, right? So all the technical people were like poo-pooing Windows. We say, that's for business majors, right? Okay, so my point to you is this. It wasn't entirely clear that Windows was going to be a successful product, let alone a dominant platform. And number two, I can tell you this, in 1993, that was the first year that, so I worked at a nuclear power plant. 91 and 92, when I was there, all we had were 2 PCs for 50 engineers. 2 PCs for 50 engineers. 1993, PCs show up on all of our desks. And so it's in this transition time when we don't even know if people are going to adopt this desktop computer lifestyle. And so there's a lot of risk there. And so the risk shows it's higher than 1 beta. And then we get into the dot-com era, looking at 98 to 2002, and the risk goes even higher. Now, here's the trick to that. At that time, anything that was related to computers at all, what do you think happened to their share prices as a result of their relationship with computers? Yeah, it goes up, right? And in fact, there was a study of, it was a finance study, and all they did was looked at companies that changed their company name to, let's say it was Frank.com. And as soon as they change it to Frank.com, whoop, the stock goes up. Did they change anything about their underlying operations? No. And so you see a lot of crap going on at this time, and one of the things is that we see betas of all these computer type companies going up simply because they're going up more than the market overall. Now we're still above 1, we're still relatively risky, and then we get into 2003 to 2007. And what happens to beta? It goes actually below 1. Is it more or less risky than the market now? Yeah, it's less risky. And let's talk about why that is. By that point, do we have widespread PC adoption? Yeah. By that point, do we know what the dominant operating system is? Yeah, it's dominant. Windows is dominant. And in fact, in this time frame, Apple's still trying to claw their way back out of the hole they dug themselves. And so what we see here is that basically being Microsoft becomes just a license to print money. The other thing is, prior to this period, we were using, in fact, the word processing software that I was trained to use was called WordPerfect. WordPerfect. And the spreadsheet I was trained to use was called Quattro Pro. Now, what do you think happened in this 2003 to 2007 period? What word processor do you guys use? Microsoft Word, right? And what spreadsheet do you use? Yeah, Excel. And so not only did they have the dominance in the operating system, they have the dominance in the this productivity software is what they call it.
Why do you miss the little paper clip?
Yeah, the little paper clip, that was around the mid-90s that would tap on your screen.
Yeah.
Annoying little bastard. Anyway, it was cute, but it was annoying. By the way, how do we know that it wasn't a good solution?
It's stick around.
It's gone, right? It's dead. That's survival of the fittest right there. Okay, now moving on to 2008 to 2012, we see the beta is roughly in line with the overall market. So, there are a couple of points here I want to make to you off this slide. Number one, betas change over time, and there's reasons for that. And number two, I want you to look at these patterns. Do those black dots actually fit nicely along the blue lines? No. And you can tell that some of these may be a better fit than others. For instance, 98 to 2002, that looks like a pretty good fit as far as getting the slope right. But some of these, and so does 28 to 2008 to 2012. But check out the two on the left. How many of you know what a shotgun is? Okay, shotgun. Does it shoot one bullet or many bullets? Many. So if I were to take my shotgun out and put up a piece of cardboard, I could shoot at that cardboard and produce a pattern that looks a whole lot like those two on the left. Would it be meaningful for me to get the X and Y coordinates of those shotgun pellets and do a linear regression? I'm already getting a no from Mr. Fisher. Absolutely not. You can take data, and in fact, one of the things that we say in research is you can torture the data until it confesses, even though basically there's not much going on there. And so you got to keep in mind that all of these betas that we come up with are merely estimates. What's another word for estimate? Swag. What does swag stand for? Scientific wild ass guess. Now, what does that mean for us? A lot of times students will figure out this beta and they're like, ha! The beta is exactly 1.81. No, that's just our very best guess of what beta is. Does that make sense? Okay. By the way, how do we get those blue lines? Linear regression. Okay. Now, this is something your textbook says, and it sounds appealing. They say, well, wait a minute. We know that you want to have a large sample size, and we also know that you want to keep it fresh. So you can have your cake and eat it too. Here's all you need to do. Just find a bunch of companies that are doing identically the same thing that you are, and just look at the last year from all of those, and so that's really fresh. And so let's say you find 5 companies that are identical to yours, and you look at 1 year worth of data. That's like looking at 5 years worth of data for one company, only it's much fresher. Does that sound logically appealing? You can tell I'm building up to it. This is a total crap thing, right? Okay, so that's the argument. Let's walk through how it works. Let's assume we're in the software business, and so we want to know what is the beta in the software industry. And they've got a list of companies here that are theoretically in the software industry. The first one is Microsoft. Is Microsoft in the software industry? Yes, but is that all that Microsoft does? I'm going to ask Mr. Fisher, if I had to guess, do you have an Xbox? Wow. Psych. Okay, so the Xbox, would you characterize it as hardware or software?
The box itself.
The box itself.
Hardware.
Yeah, it's hardware. Microsoft is not a pure software company, so mark it off the list. Number 2, Apple Inc. Does Apple write their own software? Yeah, iOS 16 or whatever, right? They write their own software, but are they a pure software company? Nope, I've got an iPhone right there that says they're not, so scratch them off the list. Automatic Data Processing, ADP. Any of you work for a small to medium-sized enterprise, if you look at your check stub, down in the lower right-hand corner, you probably see that it says ADP. And so what happens is companies outsource their payroll to ADP. Now, let's talk about what ADP does. They've built a web portal where you go and you put in all the information about your employees, and then you enter their time, and it figures neat things for you like how much to withhold, and the insurance and all this other kind of stuff. And then they have access to your company's checking account, so you have to be kind of trusting of them. But they will pull money out of your checking account, and they will send the correct amounts of money to insurance company, union dues, taxes, that sort of thing. And then the remaining money, they will direct deposit into your employee's account, or cut them a hard copy check if you're still in the Stone Age. And then they send those check stubs out. Now, does that sound like a software company? I think it's more like business services, because it's really not the software that's their primary product. It's the doing of the payroll, right? Okay, now let me tell you, and this is just purely for your benefit going forward as future managers. Should you ever allow your assistant to hand out paychecks, or should you hand them out yourself? Yeah, hand them out yourself. Why?
You can't trust anybody but yourself.
Okay, that's number one. That's true.
Perception of the employee.
The perception of the employee. What do you mean, Mr. Green?
The boss is going to check, you probably have a little more respect as you weren't you.
Yeah. So the first time I was ever responsible for the distribution of the checks, my right-hand man, Carl, came up. He says, checks are in. Should I hand them out? I said, sure. The other people at my level in the organization who were standing around drinking coffee like we did, they're all like, and I'm like, what? They're like, never, never, never. You always hand the checks out. And here's why. Because they want to know, you want them to know that every good thing in this world comes from you. And that you have the power to take it away. And they were absolutely right. It's like about this in doctoral school, some young Gulf War vets moved in next door, and they got a pit bull puppy. Now, do you think I was pleased that they got? No, those things kill kids, right? So I didn't, even though I didn't have kids, I'm not all that big, so I was a little concerned. So what do you think I did? Any ideas along these lines? I bought a box of dog treats, and every morning and every evening, I would say, Killer! And Killer would come to the fence, and I would feed Killer. So now, do you see how this kind of is similar to the handing out of the checks? Does that make sense? Now, Killer wasn't smart enough to realize that I could start withholding bones to try to, but hopefully your employees are. Questions? Okay, ADP, I think we can scratch them off the list. Then we have Oracle. What is Oracle famous for? Data what's?
Everything with data storage.
Data, so databases would be
Databases.
what we would say. This is the original. Now, and they've been buying up all sorts of other databases. So far, so good. But they also bought, if I recall correctly, Sun Microsystems. Now, you guys probably know Sun Microsystems as the author of Java. But Sun Microsystems also, at least at one point in history, made terminals, because I was actually trained to do computer-aided design on a Sun Microsystems terminal. And so Oracle is not a pure software play. We're going to scratch it off the list. And then there's Computer Sciences. I'm not sure what they do. Computer Associates, I think what they do is they go around and they buy up licenses for old software that are no longer supported, and then they provide support for them. So that's more like a business services, more like a help desk. So we're going to scratch them off. And then there's Fiserv, and Fiserv writes software for banks. Does that sound like a software company? Yeah, and it would be if they also didn't process credit card transactions. That's more of a business services kind of thing. So we got to cross them off the list too. And then we have Accenture. Accenture is a consulting firm. It used to be called Anderson Consulting. Now it's Accenture. And what do? They go. I actually had a cousin that worked for them, and he would go around installing software at firms' locations. Now, did they write the software? No. They would install. Then they were agnostic. They would install any software you wanted. If you wanted SAP, whoop, you got it. If you wanted Oracle, you got it, right? So they're software agnostic. They're not writing the software. They're actually more of a consulting or business services firm, so we're going to cross them off the list too. Then we have Symantec. What does Symantec do? Nobody knows. If I say Norton, what does Norton do?
Security.
Yeah, so antivirus. And by the way, antivirus companies are getting killed off by basically Microsoft, right? Because Microsoft Defender is about as good as anything you could buy, so why worry about it? So you can tell it's kind of dated. Okay, but Symantec, if you're only going to pay for one kind, and by the way, it is a pure software company, but if you're only going to pay for one kind of software update during bad times, which one would it be? The antivirus, right? Could we struggle on a little longer with Word 2016? Yeah. In fact, when they come out with a new one, they're like, whoo, Word 2023. And I look at it and I'm like, it looks like Word 2016 to me, right? And so that's why you see the beta of that being low. Now, if we were doing antivirus software, that would be a great thing to include. But if we're just looking software writ large, probably not. And then finally, Paychex Inc. If you had to guess, what do you think business they are in? Payroll, just like ADP, right? And so what I'm telling you is this whole argument that you can find a bunch of firms doing exactly what you're doing and use their betas and keep your freshness is just crap. So don't believe that. Questions? Now we're going to talk about business cyclicality and how it impacts beta. I'm so fortunate to have two economists in the class. Oh yeah. So, Mr. Holman, what is business cyclicality? What is the business cycle? Cycle of the business, he said. Okay, I'm quickly coming to the conclusion that an undergrad in economics was more about partying than studying.
I would say it's more about the unique things within economics. There was a lot of like random classes, like
Random
behavioral economics and game theory and
Yeah, so they teach you all this advanced stuff without giving you the very basics. That's kind of like building your house on the sand.
yes.
Yeah, that's not good. Today we will educate you about what the business cycle is. Okay, so here's the
Rise
idea.
and falls of business.
Yeah, so do you think the economy is always growing?
No.
No. And in fact, we see in developed economies, there's this cycle. There's growth and then there's recession. There's growth and then there's recession. Now, it's not a regular thing. You could go years without a recession, and you can go for a long time without growth. Check out Japan. And so what we're saying here is there's this cycle though. Now, I used to teach China EMBA, and I had all these lovely Chinese people in my class, and when I would talk about this, they would say, no, the economy always grows. Now, why do you think those folks had it in their minds that the economy always grows? Any ideas?
China's been growing for a while.
Yeah, since they were old enough to be paying attention to such things, China's economy had always been growing. Is that true anymore?
No.
No, absolutely not. In fact, the recent number of 3.9% growth in the most recent quarter, total crap. There is no way that's true. Okay, so if a firm's business is good in these good economic times, we say that it is cyclical or pro-cyclical. Cyclical or pro-cyclical. So we would use both of those terms interchangeably. If a firm has good sales in bad economic times, we say it is counter-cyclical. We say it is counter-cyclical. So when we were talking about negative beta stocks, I told you about gold mining stocks. Gold mining stocks are counter-cyclical because when the economy overall is good, they're down. When the economy overall is down, they're up. So they're counter-cyclical. So that's the very basis, the very genesis of where beta comes from. Okay, now one thing that we have to remember here is that beta is sensitivity to systematic or market risk. And so it's not just volatility. And so this cyclicality is not just volatility. It has to be the response to the underlying changes in the economy. So I'll give you an example. We talked about movie studios. Movie studios might have cash flows that are volatile, meaning that they're all over the place, but they're not likely cyclical. In fact, movies are slightly counter-cyclical because people go to movies more when economic times are bad for purposes of escape or because they can't afford to pay the electric bill and they need to sit in air conditioning. There are many reasons to go. Oh, place to sleep, right? Okay, so cyclicality is not simply volatility. All I have to do is carry enough stuff in my portfolio and I no longer have to worry about that volatility, which is the total risk. The only people I can see being concerned about this simple volatility would be people with hugely and diversified portfolios. Example, my sister. The great majority of my sister's wealth has to do with her 1/4 stake in a company. Do you think she should be more concerned about cyclicality or volatility? And volatility, she has to worry about them both, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Now let's talk about, and I'm going to start drawing a picture here for you. Let's see. We'll start with the economy. And I'm going to do everything with an up arrow here just because we're trying to be positive today. So if the economy is up, a couple of things happen. Generally, the market is up. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, then, looking at business cyclicality, if this is pro-cyclical, what's going to happen to the sales at the firm as the economy goes up? Yeah, it's going to go up as well. So far we have learned that as the economy goes up, if the pro-cyclical company, sales are going to go up, and at the same time, the market is going up. Now, why am I concerned about the market? Because this is our systematic risk, right? This is our systematic or market risk. So that's the basis for beta. So I'm going to show you how all of this plays together to come up with beta. Now, the next thing that we're going to look at is called operating leverage. And operating leverage is all about the sensitivity of the firm's profits to changes in sales. Now, our particular textbook uses EBIT. What does EBIT stand for, Mr. Umfleet?
Earnings before interest and taxes.
Very good, earnings before interest and taxes. And but I've seen it with other measures. You can see it with operating cash flow. You can see it with, net income. Any kind of measure of profitability you can think of has probably been thrown in there. And all we're looking at is the percent change in that profitability measure divided by the percent change in sales. So that's going to be the next thing that helps us determine profit. And so this profit, if sales are up, we would hope profit's up, right? Sales are up, profit's up, and how this relationship is governed is through this operating leverage. Now let's talk about how let's give some examples here. If I have two companies, one of them has an operating leverage of 1. That means that for every 10% increase in sales, how much is profit up? Ms. Moreno.
Sorry.
I caught her yawning, trying to wake her up. Okay, so operating leverage of 1. If sales are up 10%, how much would profit be up? 10%, right? I had to ask someone that knew math, right? Okay, so now what about if the firm's operating leverage was 3? The same 10% change in sales, Ms. Wabi. 30%, right? Now, at first you're like, woohoo, that's operating leverage is some good stuff. Let's run this the other way. What if sales are down 10%? Ms. Moreno, how much or is profit down for the operating leverage of 1? Minus 10. And Ms. Wabi, how much are your profits down? Negative 30. Do you see how operating leverage is kind of like beta? It's related to beta in this way, in that the higher it is, the better off you are during good times, and the worse off you are during bad times. And we said that this volatility, this roughness, that's risk, right? So the higher your operating leverage, the higher your risk. And in fact, this operating leverage acts as a magnifying glass. So I'm going to draw a really crummy picture of a magnifying glass here. It's basically magnifying the impact of business cyclicality. If your business wasn't cyclical at all, then there's no change in sales, and so what would your change in profit be? None. So basically, it's just a multiplier effect, a magnifying effect. If there's nothing there to magnify, it doesn't matter, but if there's anything positive or negative, then it's going to magnify it. Questions? Now, let's see. Oh, I'm probably missing a slide here, but I'd rather just tell you about it. And that's to answer the question, well, how is operating leverage determined? And it has to do with the mixture of fixed and variable costs at a company. It's the mixture of fixed and variable costs at a company. So let me give you an example of a business with an operating leverage of 1. Have you guys ever watched a show called How It's Made? How It's Made. I love that show. It's so soothing. Okay, now, one at a time they said, today on How It's Made, we're going to look at luxury Swiss watch bands. Now, in my mind, what do I think? I'm thinking of some gleaming factory in Zurich, and it's highly automated, but in fact, it was a dude at his kitchen table. It was a dude at his kitchen table, and here's what dude had. He had a big block of wood that he probably got from his grandpa or something. He had some tools. And then he had a big pot of glue. He had a big spool of thread. He had a bunch of leather and some buckles. Now let's talk about this guy's, the combination of fixed costs and variable costs that he was bearing. What do you think his fixed costs were? Almost zero, right? Let's assume that he inherited his tools from his dad. What are his fixed costs? He doesn't have any. Did he already have a kitchen table? Yeah. Was he already going to have the light on anyway? Yeah. So there are really no fixed costs here. So basically, all of his costs are variable costs. In a firm with all variable costs, the operating leverage is 1. In a firm with all variable costs, the operating leverage is 1. Okay, so what does that mean for this guy? His wife says, Hans, which is undoubtedly his name, Hans, we need 10% more money. Now, assuming that Hans can't raise his prices, what does he have to do?
He's already leverage.
Say again?
Raise the operating leverage.
Oh, raise the operating leverage. No, where's he going to get the money? You know, so there's all sorts of questions here. A simple way. She's like, Hans, we just need 10% more money to make that household run right. What's that? What has to happen to his sales?
Increase.
Increase by how much? 10%. And so basically the only way, it's a 1-to-1 correspondence. If he wants 5% more profit, he's got to produce 5% more watch bands. Now, companies with fixed costs have a difference here. So let me run through 2 examples. I visited a Honda plant in Ohio, and Honda, of course, is a Japanese company. And let's talk about, if you picture a Japanese car company in a car plant in your head, do you picture more people or robots? You say people, because you're like going against the current here. So, so if you look at Japan, there are actually more robots than people because the population's aging and people are expensive, right? But in Ohio, Honda says, phew, these people are cheap, right? Oh yeah. Oh hey, if you saw where their plant was in Ohio, you'd know why it wasn't a very nice place until they came in. Okay. So my point to you is this: their labor costs are lower there, and so I was shocked to see these cars coming down the assembly line, and it was like there was a swarm of humans around them doing things that I expected robots to do. And I also was shocked to see the guy at the end of the line that was fitting the trunk lid, making sure it fit right. You would assume he had some sort of machine which like tightened the bolts into the... No, it's like this big beefy football player guy, and he's going with the trunk lid, and then he would gently set it down, and if it wasn't quite right, He'd do it again. And then if it was really bad, he had a big old plastic hammer. Smack! Anyway, so that was the second shocking thing. The third shocking thing was this. If I say Japanese car company, what do you think the quality's like?
Good.
Yeah, you're like top notch, 99.97% perfect first time. Wrong. 1/3 of the cars were being pulled over to the side to get something fixed on them. And I asked our tour guide, I'm like, is this just a bad day? He says, no, this is how it works. Right? Now, were they letting bad cars out of the factory? No. But of course, they had a whole crew over there trying to set those straight. Okay, now, for an auto manufacturer, Honda has a relatively low operating leverage because they're dependent more on variable costs, labor, than they are on robots. What kind of cost do you think robots are?
Fixed.
Yeah, they're a fixed cost. And so if you look in the same state, you've got General Motors plants. Now, if you walk into a General Motors plant, you will notice lots of robots. Why do you think General Motors would have lots of robots, whereas Honda did not, less than 100 miles away? What's the difference?
That place.
No, it's just we're basically drawing from the same labor pool. How are the workers different between Honda and GM? They all went to the same crummy schools. They all grew up on the same farms. What's different? You guys know what a union is?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. United Automotive Workers, right? So these people have a union behind them. They're making union wages, which are considerably higher than Honda. And so anytime you see wages go up, it makes it cheaper and more reasonable to replace labor with robots. Does that make sense? And it just cracks me up when I see these people protesting for a $15 an hour wage for fast food workers. And then eventually Walmart and McDonald's, they're like, yeah, that makes sense. Let's do that. What do you think? What was the next thing that we saw start sprouting up in McDonald's?
Kiosks.
Yeah, those kiosks, right? Replacing people with machines. And so, yeah, everybody at McDonald's got a pay raise, but now there's only 7 people per shift instead of 9. And what about Walmart?
Self-checkout.
Self-checkout, right? I actually prefer self-checkout. It doesn't ever try to engage me in uncomfortable conversations, right? But, what's that?
I hate it so much.
Well, then you just feel free to continue to shop wherever it is that you don't have to interact with that. By the way, Target is pushing self-checkout. Have you been to Target lately?
No,
They're not-
the construction all overwhelmed me, so. it's
Okay,
not
well,
going for a
it's
while.
okay now. It's clean. But they're pushing the self-checkout idea, and the way, how do you force people to use self-checkout?
Limit the number of checkout stands.
Yeah, you just limit the number of checkers. Oh, they still got the same number of stands, but there's nobody there, right?
At Walmart, you can actually, on the app, check out, get Walmart Plus yourself.
Yeah.
Like while
Oh,
you're
you can do
shopping.
that at, like,
And then you
Sam's
can
Club,
just
too.
like walk out.
Yeah, and you can do that at Hy-Vee, right? Now, I think there's maybe a risk in that, and we'll talk about that probably next time. What's the risk with that kind of situation?
Shoplifting.
Shoplifting.
There's a theft with risk with that.
Oh, sure. So in descending order of theft risk, standard check stand, self-checkout, and then this bag it yourself and walk the hell out. That is the biggest way for people to steal. Okay. Now, so now let's get back to GM and Honda. Let's say Honda has 5,000 people per shift making cars. Just for those of you who do not know, most American manufacturing operations have 2 shifts, a day shift and an evening shift, and then overnight is used for maintenance and things like that. When times get really fun, 3rd shift, right? Then you got a bunch of zombies screwing stuff together. You don't want one of those cars, but that's entirely possible. Now, Honda has 5,000 people per shift, and they are currently running 2 shifts. And they need to add a 3rd shift because demand is up for their cars. What do they have to go out and do? Hire 5,000 people. That is a huge increase in their variable cost. Now let's take a look at GM. Over the years, GM has been doing everything it can to replace people with robots. And so now basically we've got 8 people on the day shift, we've got 8 people on the evening shift to take care of the robots. And by the way, I'm exaggerating hugely here, but let's assume that we're going to have to put on a third shift. How many people do I have to hire? 8, right? And so my variable cost goes up just a little bit. My fixed costs stay the same. Now what does this mean? That when the volume at Honda goes up, when sales go up, their costs go up more than General Motors. Their operating leverage is lower, so for the same increase in sales, they're going to have a lower increase in profit. But what about at General Motors? Sales go up, but the costs don't go up all that much because this huge operating leverage now, profits go up a lot for a smaller change in sales. This all sounds great, but let's figure out what happens when times go bad. Let's assume that we're back on a 2-shift operation, and instead of business growing now, it's going to fall down. What do you think Honda is going to do? They've got 5,000 people on 2 shifts. Demand is cut in half. What are they going to do? Yeah, they're going to get rid of their evening shift. Now at Honda, when you get rid of the evening shift, how many people does that mean that you fire? 5,000 people. What happens to your variable costs just instantly? Whew, right? Now, at General Motors, we've got 8 people on day shift, 8 people on evening shift. We're going to get rid of the second shift. How many people do we fire? 8. Now, the accountant says, wait a minute, why don't you get rid of some of the robots too? How do you think that goes? No way. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple reasons why. Number 1, all the robots are necessary to make a car. Number 2, the robots are bolted to the ground. So even if you could say the following to a robot and get them to understand, it still wouldn't work. And here you go. You say, robot XR49J, take your oil can and get the hell out. Is anything going to happen? No, you're stuck with that stuff. At least in the short term, you are stuck with that stuff. And so now, General Motors, their sales are way down, but their costs are not down all that much. And so what happens to their profits? No. What happens to the profits at Honda? They're down, but they're not down nearly as much as they would be at General Motors. Does that make sense? Okay. So now, let's talk about financial leverage. And if you hadn't guessed, that's going to be our next thing here. Oh, and by the way, we could look at all this as the risk of the underlying assets. So there is the risk of the business itself, and then I am so I can even make my risk worse by going with high operating leverage. In other words, a high fixed cost, low variable cost structure here. But all of that is the risk of the underlying assets. Now, we're going to start looking at how those assets are financed. Let's talk about beta. If you have a firm that is entirely equity financed, then the beta of the firm is the same. The beta of the firm's assets are the same as the beta of its stock. In other words, if I'm just using pure equity here, then it's going to my say stock price is going to move directly with the change in my profits. But what if I borrow money? What if I borrow money? what we're going to start to see is that this beta of the equity for those firms is going to be higher. And let's talk about conceptually why that might be. If I own a company 100% equity, what are the chances that I will, as the equity holder, go bankrupt? I don't owe anybody any money, right? Chance of going bankrupt, 0 or near 0, right? 0. What if I borrow some money? Now I have to make these fixed payments. And if I don't make those fixed payments, then the debt holders can force me into bankruptcy. Do I have a riskier position now than I used to? Yeah. And the more debt that I take on, the higher those fixed payments that I have to make. And as a result, the greater the risk is to me as the equity holder. What do you think means? What do you think that means happens to the beta of the equity as we take on more and more debt? It has to keep going up, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So let's see here. We call this the market. Let's call this market returns. And then let's call this over here stock returns. Okay, and how? But before I'm gonna get more into financial leverage here. But let's talk about this just in case we run out of time here. Check out what's going on here. Market returns up, stock returns up. What is the thing that links these two in our world? I'll give you a hint. It's at the top of the slide, and it ain't financial leverage.
Beta.
Beta! And so what we're really looking at here is that the link between these two is the beta of the stock. The link between the market and the market returns and the stock returns are the beta of the stock. The reason we're going through this whole discussion is so you'll understand what all is going into impacting this beta. Does that make sense? Okay. Now let's talk about financial leverage. And we could just do a weighted average. We could go out there and figure out what is the beta of the equity, what is the beta of the debt, and then we could put these weights on it. By the way, E is equal to equity, D is equal to debt. You may also see this as S for stock and B for bonds. Don't be freaked out by that. It's the same idea. Now, the percentage of the firm that is financed by equity is E over D plus E. Now, why is D plus E on the bottom? That's the total value of the firm's assets. We know assets are equal to liabilities plus owner's equity. That's all we're doing there. And we're going to multiply that weight of the piece of the capital structure that is equity times the beta of the equity that we observe out in the wild. And then we're going to come up with a similar weight for the debt. Debt divided by debt plus equity tells us the proportion of the capital structure that is debt. And then we're going to multiply by the beta of the debt. Should this formula be on your note sheet? Yeah. Now we're going to do an assumption and a simplification here momentarily that's going to make this easier, but it only works, the simplification is only available if we make the assumption. So I'll talk to you about that here in just a little bit. Any questions before we move on? Okay, here's the common assumption. We assume, unless we are told otherwise, and that's key, unless you're told otherwise, we assume that the beta of the debt is 0. And here's why. Let's take a look at equity. If times are good, profits are up, what happens to the stock price?
Goes up.
It goes up. And let's say that they're paying, let's not even do that. And then if times are bad, it's down. Unless it's one like gold mining stock like that. Now, let's think about how bonds work. In other words, this residual claim on equity is going along with the business cycle and all the rest of this. But what about debt? Times are great. I pay my $30 coupon. Times are, I pay my $30 coupon. Times are, I pay my $30 coupon. I'm going to keep paying that $30 coupon as long as I can, because if I don't, I'm going to go bankrupt, right? And so what we see then is that typically we make the assumption that the value of debt does not change with the overall economic conditions. Now, there is some, of course, some effect there, but it's so small that we typically assume that the beta of the debt is 0. And if we're able to do that, it allows us to do something amazing. You know that second term that had the weight of the debt multiplied by the beta of the debt? If that beta of the debt is 0, what happens to that entire second term? Poof, gone, right? And so that makes things a lot easier. Now, if I tell you in the problem that the beta of the debt is 0.2, can you assume the beta is 0? No. If I tell you it is something, you need to use the equation that I showed you here. If we do say that beta of debt is, or we don't say, then we can assume beta of debt is 0. And this is how we now have our beta of our asset is equal to E over D plus E times the beta of the equity. By the way, for an all equity firm, what is E over D plus E? 1, and so the beta of the asset would be equal to the beta of the equity, which is how we started this whole discussion, right? Okay, now let's see what that allows us to do. We can actually rearrange and show that the beta of the equity is equal to basically the equity multiplier times the beta of the assets. How do I know it's the equity multiplier? It's 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. We said that is equal to the equity multiplier. And so basically all we're going to do is take the beta of the assets, which is, by the way, this thing here. And we're going to multiply them by our financial leverage as measured by the equity multiplier. And that's going to magnify this risk of the underlying assets to give us the risk of the equity. So that's what we're doing there. Now, what does this mean? If a firm has no debt whatsoever, we just discussed that the beta of the equity is equal to the beta of the assets. But as we add more and more debt, the beta of the equity climbs away from the beta of the assets. It's very similar to this relationship we looked at in Chapter 3. Let's see, it's ROE is equal to ROA times the equity multiplier. If the equity multiplier is 1, these are the same. But as we get more and more debt, this ROE climbs away from ROA. It's the same relationship. Questions? Okay, so that is how we managed to throw all this stuff in to come up with beta. Now, this is more of a conceptual thing. Am I going to give you numbers and ask you to calculate a beta based on all of this? No. I might give you the beta of the underlying assets and ask you to calculate the beta of the equity, which I just gave you a formula for, right? But I'm not going to start by telling you the economy is up 2%. What's the beta of the firm? I'm not going to do that. Questions? Okay, so all of that had to do with coming up for the ingredients for the security market line. And we said there was another way for us to determine the required return on equity, and that is the dividend discount model. I think back to Chapter 6, this dividend discount model only works for firms with constantly growing dividends. How many firms out there do you think have constantly growing dividends? Do you think they all do? Perhaps if the growth rate is 0 or negative, perhaps, right? But no, you don't see a lot of constant growth dividend firms. The ones that we say are closest to this model are electric utilities. Electric utilities. My dad, this is one of the reasons he's a big fan of electric utilities, is this constant growth in the dividend, in the size of the dividends, and it's roughly, for electric utilities, it roughly goes along with inflation. And so that means that every year, him and mom can still get the Big Mac fries and a Coke. They can still afford that. They don't have to trade down to the Wendy's Junior Cheeseburger, right? And so that's the benefit of that. But my point to you is this doesn't fit all firms. Before you use something like this, make sure that the firm has constantly growing dividends. Okay, now that growth rate, we can either look at historical growth in the dividends, or this was actually another question people missed on the exam. The growth rate is B times ROE. We all know what ROE is. What is B? Plowback ratio. What's another name for plowback ratio? Retention ratio, right? And so that is another way for us to estimate the growth rate. Now, once again, it doesn't work for firms without dividends that are growing at a constant rate. Now, let's ask this. What if I give you a problem and I give you the following information? The risk-free rate, the expected return on the market, and the beta. Which of these are you going to use to figure out the cost of equity capital? Can you use the dividend discount model? Did I give you the stock price? Did I give you the next dividend? Did I give you a growth rate? No. What if I give you the dividend and the price and the growth rate? You know you've got to use this one. If I give you that other stuff, you've got to use security market line. It's a whole lot like when we go at home of an evening. I do the cooking at our house. And so my wife will say, what are we going to have? And I'm like, I don't know. And I open up the cupboard and the fridge, and here's what I see. I see, let's say I see some ground beef, I see some ragu sauce, and I see a bunch of vermicelli, which is like a smaller spaghetti, and some mozzarella cheese. What do you think I'm making for dinner? Yeah, spaghetti, right? Tacos. Who said that? Was that you, Mr. Fisher? Yeah.
Spaghetti tacos.
Spaghetti taco. That's disgusting. Okay. But my point to you is this. Look at the ingredients you're given. Figure out what dish you're going to cook, right? Now, what about this? What if I give you enough to both do the dividend discount model and to do the security market line? What should you do? Ms. Wabi, what do you think you should do if you're given ingredients for both? Oh!
Whichever you feel like is easier for you.
Lazy Generation Z. Oh my goodness.
You mean capital is both?
We're still using the what?
I'm still using the dinner metaphor.
No, we're moved on now. No.
I feel like in that game, like.
No. So we have to drop the dinner metaphor at this point unless you want to get really fat, right?
You calculate both and compare
And how do you compare? What do you do?
just
Do we have any reason to believe one of them is better than the other?
no.
No. So what should we do?
Just that's the answer.
Add them together,
Oh.
divide by 2,
Yeah.
right? Add them together, divide by 2. You're right, the dinner metaphor broke down. I don't recommend that. I used to live that way and I weighed 40 more pounds, so we don't do that. Questions? Okay.
Did you say where you at?
What's that? What are we having for dinner? You're all hungry now, right? I'm thinking about
Do
spaghetti.
people not make like full lists of what they're eating that week then? I mean, like,
You know,
that's
my
how
wife
do
and I-
my grocery shopping.
Yeah, my wife and I do have a list on the side of the fridge, but that's totally nerdy, right? What's the conversation more often with people?
What's for dinner?
What's for dinner? What do you want for dinner? I don't know, right? Where do you want to go? I don't know, right? And an hour and a half later, there you are. Well, anyway,
Tacos.
tacos.
Really tacos.
So forever they will be called Fisher tacos. Question.